Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a story that's got drama, power struggles, and some seriously creepy events.
Sounds intense.
It is. We're looking at Exodus chapter 8 from the King James Version of the Bible.
Ah, the plagues.
Exactly. It's a classic story, but there's a lot there that, still applies today. We're going to see this power struggle between Moses, who's acting on behalf of God, and Pharaoh.
The leader of Egypt.
Yeah, and he's not exactly a pushover.
Not at all. This chapter actually sets up a really important theme that we'll see throughout Exodus. Pharaoh's hard heart. We'll see him almost give in, even offer to compromise, but ultimately he always ends up resisting, defying God, and that sets the stage for, more and more intense showdowns. It's really fascinating to see how that plays out.
It's almost like, we'll get into that, but first, can you set the scene for us? The Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and then God tells Moses to go demand their release, but
Pharaoh's not exactly the kind of guy to just say, okay, sure, no problem.
Right, so what happens?
Well, Pharaoh's first response to Moses is basically, who is this God that I should listen to him? Which is, a pretty bold statement. But you have to remember, Pharaoh saw himself as a God king. Challenging him was like challenging the entire universe.
So God decides to make his presence known.
Dramatically.
Dramatically, and that's where the plagues come in. The first one, and it's a big one, frogs.
Yeah.
And I don't mean just a few by the river, frogs everywhere. In homes, bedrooms, ovens.
It would have been pure chaos.
Yeah.
Daily life completely disrupted. And think about it, frogs were really symbolic in Egyptian mythology. They represented things like fertility and rebirth. So turning them into a plague, that would have been seen as a direct attack on their gods, their whole society, their beliefs.
It's more than just gross, it's a targeted attack on their beliefs. So what's Pharaoh's reaction to this amphibian invasion?
Well, at first, he tries to stand his ground.
Of course.
He calls in his magicians. They try to use their magic to create more frogs,
Oh.
which I think is an important detail because it really highlights the power struggle here. It's not just Moses versus Pharaoh. It's the God of Israel versus the gods of Egypt.
A battle of the supernatural.
Yeah,
So I'm guessing even Pharaoh has his limits.
he does. The text actually says that he was grieved by all these frogs. And eventually, he breaks down. He begs Moses to talk to God to make it stop. And he promises to let the Israelites go if God gets rid of the frogs.
Sounds like a win for Moses.
Maybe.
But, I sense a but coming.
There is a but. So Pharaoh tries to bargain. He wants the frogs gone for the palace and the cities. Fine. But he's okay with them staying in the river. He's acknowledging God's power, but he's still trying to control the situation.
It's like he's saying, all right, you win this round, God, but I'm still calling some of the shots here.
Exactly. And Moses, who is a pretty smart guy, sees right through it. So instead of just making the frogs disappear, he says something interesting. He says to Pharaoh, "Glory over me. When shall I entreat for thee?" Basically giving Pharaoh a chance to publicly admit that God is in control.
A power move, but also a teaching moment?
Yeah, I think so. Moses is showing that true freedom is about surrendering to something bigger than yourself, not clinging to control.
So did Pharaoh learn his lesson?
Well, he agreed to Moses' request, and the next day, the frogs were gone. Except for the ones in the river, of course.
Of course.
But as soon as the pressure was off, Pharaoh's heart hardens,
Ugh, classic Pharaoh.
and he breaks his promise.
This guy. It's like he gets a taste of freedom, then runs right back to his old ways.
It's a pattern we're going to see again and again.
And again.
And again. It's a pattern you see throughout history. Like you get a little relief, and you forget about the need for real change.
It's true. It's true. So the frogs are gone. Pharaoh's back to his old tricks. What does God do next? How does he get Pharaoh's attention?
Well, this time it's something a little more personal.
Yeah.
A little more, shall we say, itchy.
Oh, no.
The plague of lice.
Lice.
Tiny little insects. They come from the dust, and they infest everything. Everyone.
I can feel myself itching already. But this is more than just annoying, right?
Oh, yeah. First of all, it goes against everything the Egyptians believed about cleanliness and purity, especially the priests. They were very careful about hygiene. So being covered in lice would have been like the ultimate humiliation and spiritual defilement.
So God is attacking their religion, their practices.
Exactly. And I'm sure their magicians were not happy about this either. They tried to make their own lice, with magic,
Yeah.
but they couldn't do it.
Really?
For the first time, their magic fails. And they actually admit it. They say, this is the finger of God.
It's like a public admission that they're not as powerful as they thought they were.
Right. So you'd think Pharaoh would finally get the message.
You would think.
But nope. His heart hardens again. He can't bring himself to admit that these plagues are from the God of Israel.
So stubborn. He has a chance to change everything, to set the Israelites free and avoid all the suffering, but he just won't.
He won't. So things escalate. The next plague is flies.
Flies.
Swarms of them everywhere, in their homes, on their food,
Yeah.
just covering everything.
It's like an apocalyptic movie or something. Nature itself is turning against them.
That's a good way to put it. But there's a twist this time.
What's that?
The land of Goshen, where the Israelites live, isn't affected. No flies there.
So God's protecting his people, making it very clear who he's on the side of.
Absolutely. So how does this affect Pharaoh?
Well, does he finally get it?
He offers a compromise.
Oh.
He says, okay, fine, you can go sacrifice to your God, but you have to do it here in Egypt.
Still trying to control things? Typical?
Totally. But Moses, he sees through this. He says, we can't sacrifice here. That would be offensive to your gods. It could even lead to violence against us.
The abomination of the Egyptians. That's how it's described in the text.
Right. And this shows how deep the conflict really is. The Egyptians had their own very strict rules about sacrifice. What the Israelites did was completely unacceptable to them.
So it's not just about freedom to worship, it's freedom to worship differently.
Exactly. It's about respecting their own beliefs, even if they clash with the Egyptians. And Pharaoh is just not having it.
But he does seem to budge a little, right? He says they can go into the wilderness, but not too far.
He does say that. Maybe he's trying to compromise.
Or maybe he's just trying to keep them on a leash.
Could be. It's hard to know what's really going on in his head. But we'll see how this plays out, because the story doesn't end there.
So Pharaoh's offered this compromise, let the Israelites go into the wilderness to sacrifice, but not too far. But something tells me this isn't the end of the story.
You'd be right about that. Pharaoh seems to think he can bargain with divine power, trying to stay in control. But we're about to see that real freedom, well, you can't bargain for that.
So what happens next? Another plague. Does God have to remind Pharaoh who's really calling the shots?
He does. And this time, it hits Pharaoh where it hurts, his livelihood. The next plague affects livestock, all of it. Horses, donkeys, camels, even oxen and sheep.
That's a big deal. It's not just about the Israelites anymore. This affects all of Egypt. How can Pharaoh keep justifying this, holding on to power?
It is a turning point. You would think he'd finally change his mind, but no. His heart hardens again. Even with everything falling apart, he's stubborn.
It's like the worse things get, the more determined he is to resist.
Yeah.
But one thing that stood out to me, the Israelites' animals were fine.
Right, their livestock was spared, which shows how God is protecting his people. There's a clear difference between those who follow God and those who defy him. And that idea of separation, well, it becomes even more important in the next plague.
Okay, what is it this time? Don't tell me it's frogs again.
No more frogs. But this one is pretty disturbing. Boils. Painful boils on people and animals.
Ouch. Even in those days, they knew how to make a point. It's like the whole land is infected.
Yeah, like a physical representation of the conflict. And this time, even the magicians, you know, the ones who kept trying to copy God's power, they get boils too. Their power is gone. It's pointless to go against God's will.
So, is Pharaoh ready to give up now? What will it take?
Well, it's not just one thing, but there's this series of plagues. Hail, locusts, and finally, darkness. These finally push Pharaoh to his limit.
Let's break those down. First, hail. We've all seen a hailstorm, but I have a feeling this is not your average bad weather.
You got that right. The hail is described as being mixed with fire, destroying crops, livestock, even killing people. It's scary, like a natural disaster, but also divine judgment all at once.
A show of force. Did Pharaoh finally get the message?
It seems like there's a moment of realization. For the first time, even his advisors admit that God is powerful, tell him to stop fighting.
So did he listen?
For a second, yes. He admits he's wrong, says God is right, and asks Moses to make the hail stop.
Finally, a breakthrough.
But then, you guessed it, his heart hardens again. The hail stops, and Pharaoh goes right back to refusing to let the Israelites go. It's like he can't stop himself.
Okay, so another plague. What is it?
Locusts. Swarms of them. So many they block out the sun. They eat every plant, leaving the land bare and empty. Even Pharaoh's advisors, they beg him to let the Israelites go. They know Egypt is doomed.
This has got to be it, right? There's nothing left to argue about.
Pharaoh makes another offer, but he still won't completely surrender. He says he'll let the men go, but their families have to stay as collateral.
He's playing a dangerous game. What happened?
Moses refuses. He says all the Israelites have to go free, everyone. Pharaoh gets angry, and he sends Moses and Aaron away. And that leads to the last plague, darkness.
Darkness. A blackout. What's so bad about that?
This is different. It's thick darkness. Covers all of Egypt for 3 days. People are stuck in their homes, can't see, can't do anything. It affects their minds, too, not just the physical world.
Like a psychological torture.
Right. So how does Pharaoh handle this?
I bet he finally caves.
He does. He calls for Moses and says, fine, the Israelites can go. But then he says they have to leave their animals behind.
He can't help himself. Even when he's losing, he's trying to control things.
Exactly. But Moses, he won't compromise. He wants total freedom. He tells Pharaoh, all our animals are going with us. Not a single hoof will be left behind. It's God's victory and Pharaoh's defeat.
So what happens then? Do the Israelites just walk out of Egypt?
Yes, but it's not a happy ending. The chapter ends with Pharaoh waking up in the night, and there are cries throughout all of Egypt. Every house has experienced death, the price of Pharaoh's defiance.
Wow. Powerful. The darkness is gone, but now they see what they've lost. A lot to think about there.
Definitely. Exodus chapter 8 isn't just a story about freedom. It shows us human nature, that struggle between wanting control and finding freedom and letting go. Pharaoh, he keeps hardening his heart, and it's a warning. Holding on to power and pride, well, that can lead to destruction. But humility and obedience to something bigger than yourself, that can set you free.
That's deep. We've seen these epic power struggles, plagues, and this glimpse into what Pharaoh is going through. If you were giving Pharaoh advice at the beginning of all this, what would you say?
That's a good question. I guess the most important thing would be, know that your power has limits, and be open to surrendering to something bigger than yourself. Because real freedom, it doesn't come from control. It comes from letting go.
Something to think about. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into Exodus chapter 8. It's a story that still speaks to us even thousands of years later. It teaches us about power, freedom, and what it means to be human. Thanks for joining us, everyone.